Welcome to a tutorial video on Twine 2.1. In this video I'm going to go over the Windowpassage object as part of Snowman 1.3. Like other functionality in Harlow and SugarCube story formats, information about the current passage can be accessed through the window.passage global object in Snowman. Different properties of this Windowpassage object can be accessed through the ID, where that is the identification number of the current passage, the name of the current passage, and source, the content of the current passage. And here's an example right here. So we have the ID of the passage, which is 2, it's the second passage, as well as the name of this passage, which was properties, and we'll look at the code in a few moments. Echoing functionality found in Windows Story, Windowpassage also has the function render, which parses the markdown, if any, in the current passage and returns the HTML result. Now we see here it says this text will be green, and in fact it is. And it'll make more sense if we go look at the code, so let's do that right now. So we see the story starts with the start passage. So we open that up, and we see the start passage merely points at the properties passage. So let's go look at that. The properties passage is where things start to work with the Windowpassage object. So we see here with some JavaScript starting here and ending here that it's concatenating to property list and then changing an element with the ID log, which is this right here, changing its HTML to whatever we pass to it. So in this case, we're saying the ID of the passage, and then using Windowpassage ID, which is the ID of the current passage, which we saw in practice, which was 2. Again, down here we see the name of the passage, which is Windowpassage name, the name of the current passage. So we got it, and it was properties, which of course matches right here. Now, I could have also used Windowpassage source, but it would have crashed everything because we can't show the source when we're currently trying to render it without being sort of a nightmare and crashing the code. So obviously that's not a good idea. Moving on to functions though, we see an example of Windowpassage render. Because as the story progresses, Windowpassage is set to a passage object, which was the ID, name, source, and render function as the story progresses. So in this case, we can use the WindowStoryPassage function to look for a passage within the story with the name example passage. We can then return that object and chain these functions by then calling its render function. Now remember, of course, we can't call the render on itself because that would just be sort of an infinite loop of recursion, but we can call the render on another passage to get its rendered result, which is what I have here. So using WindowStoryPassage, we look for a passage in the story, like I said, with example passage. We render, that is, change if it has any markdown or other things into HTML. And so rendered passage has all that. And then we change, like in the last passage, the HTML content of an element with the ID log, which right here, ID log, and we change its rendered passage. Now it may have been a little confusing if you didn't already know that Snowman, even though it's not as well documented in places, has its own version of Markdown similar to Harlow and SugarCube. So let's go look at that. So within example passage here, we have the Markdown that's within Snowman. So notice that it starts on a first line with an open bracket, close bracket, and then within braces here, a hash showing this is the ID to be set, render example, this text will be green. Now by itself, this will be changed into an element with the content, whatever was within the brackets, with the ID set to whatever this is within the braces is here. So let's go look at one additional thing I added so it changed the color. Now if we ever want to look at the story style sheet of a story when we're looking at the editor interface in Twine, we first click on the name of the story and then go to edit story style sheet. Now here, for example, I've added an extra style. So whenever there's an element with the ID render example, change the font color to green. And so that's what happened over here. Using the render function, it parsed the markdown, which was the markdown in example passage, rendered it, that is, converted it to HTML, and then passed it back into this, which used JavaScript over here in functions, using jQuery to put it as the content of this, which is sort of a complicated roundabout way of saying that you can use some markdown within Snowman, as well as use the window passage or the passage object's render function to render, parse some markdown or whatever else is in a function, return that result, and then do something with it. And we couldn't, of course, call it on itself because that would have been a huge mess. But the Windowpassage global object has those four general things. It has an ID, the ID of the current passage. It has the name of the current passage, as well as the source of the current passage. And like I said, the render function, which renders or parses the source and then returns it as a string to save it or act on it in some other way. But these are the four general things of the Windowpassage object. And like I said, it echoes functionality found in Harlow and SugarCube as well. Getting the ID, getting the name, getting the source, doing something with the source as well. Echoing the functionality found in the other story formats, that is. Thanks for watching.